Adrian Hon, game designer, author of You've Been Played: How Corporations, Governments, and Schools Use Games to Control Us All. Adrian, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, great to be here.
Um, yeah, great to have you. So, the term gamification, how do you broadly define it as something that's taken over so many sectors over the past few decades? I mean, rating Uber drivers is an example that you give right off the bat, but to start more broadly, how do you define that term?
Yeah, I mean, gamification is pretty broad. It basically means using ideas from game design, from video games, in non-game purposes. So maybe using ideas like badges, points, missions, levels, quests for education, for the workplace, for fitness, all sorts of things. So it's pretty broad, but I think a lot of people, when they see it, they recognize it.
And yeah, so there's some hallmarks of it, achievement points, right? Stars or I guess different things you can accumulate, all that kind of stuff. And I mean, how is this in any way really like different, at least from the workplace side, from traditional performance review?
Yeah, I mean, workplaces, factories, a lot of institutions have always wanted to monitor workers' performance. Over the years, that's not a new thing. It's been around for centuries, if not millennia. And they've always had some way of rewarding or punishing workers for their performance. So, in that respect, it's not new. I think there's kind of two things that have really changed in the last 10 to 20 years. The first part is that the level of monitoring is just much more detailed and just completely non-stop compared to the past, right? It might be that you're rated on your output over a day. They just count up how much work how many pieces you've completed in a day. Now, if you work at Amazon, if you work at Uber, a lot of companies, call centers, they can monitor your performance down to the second, and they can see, literally where you're moving, what things you're clicking. So that's kind of being able to monitor you. And I think what's interesting about gamification is how they feed back on your performance. So it used to be in the past, you get a little letter in the mail saying you need to work harder, otherwise you're fired. Or a manager might come up to you, and have a chat with you. And now, increasingly, we're seeing that kind of feedback from bosses and from management come in the form of a game where it will say, look, you've slipped down this leaderboard, or you haven't gotten these achievements, or you have got these achievements. You're outperforming people on the factory floor. You've completed these quests, and so now you can level up. That is the difference. And so it does have similar roots to Taylorism, to other forms of management, but it's in a very different lens in terms of just how constant it is and how it's dressed up in these kind of clothes of video games.
Right. And can you expand on that fact, how it is a version of electronic surveillance, which we've talked about on this program, but there's a different layer to it. I mean, I know that you have a background as a developer, and you've made arguments for ethical gaming, so you kind of understand what these checkpoints might look like to make it a game as opposed to just standard electronic monitoring. What are some of those indicators?
Well, I think it's a bit of a family resemblance. So, but one example would be, how you talk about the work, right? So instead of saying, okay, here's your assignment for today, here's your quest for today, and it is shown using kind of graphics, pixel art or achievement badges that we've seen from games. I think there are elements like competition, so where you are competing against other people, your colleagues, for space on a leaderboard. I think that there are things like joining rewards or punishments automatically to your performance. So that's kind of a big, a different thing. Usually there is some, in the past, that there's usually some sort of human manager deciding, okay, I think this person has done better or worse. Whereas in a game, of course, we're used to video games being automatic. If you fail this level, that's it. You are instantly punished or rewarded if you pass. So I think those are two kind of big parts of it. And you see that in places like Uber, where they will literally offer drivers quests periodically, and if you accept the quest, then you have to go and I mean, that's what they call it, and you have to complete a certain number of trips and carry a certain number of passengers within a time window. And if you do that, then you get a bonus. And that sounds great. Obviously, you think, wow, who wouldn't want extra money? But if you talk to the drivers, if you see what they say, they're like, actually, the problem is that it's not really fair. A lot of the quests you go on, they feel like they're set up to fail. And that's where it becomes different from a traditional board game or video game, which is designed to be fair. With gamification in the workplace, there's no reason why it has to be fair. I mean, they can set up a quest where you're always 1 or 2 trips away from winning. And that's something we've seen people in other countries complain about, delivery drivers and gig economy workers around the world, talk about this sort of thing.
Yeah, the gig economy element is, I really think, is such an important piece because it dresses up the work in a way that obscures the lack of protections or wage increases that should be in place. But to step back a little, I'm hoping that we could trace the origins of this, starting earlier in your book to the early 2000s when I think you talk about Foursquare, other apps like that began this kind of trend. Take us to that point.
Yeah, I mean, gamification is kind of so pervasive now. It's hard to remember that it's actually quite new. The term really started becoming used about 15 years ago, and that is when apps like Foursquare, where people would basically check into real world locations like bars and cafes and museums to let their friends know where they've been. And by checking in, you could get points and rise up a leaderboard and get sometimes real world rewards by becoming the mayor of a location, by being a regular. And Foursquare did really well. It had lots of downloads for the time. And a lot of people thought that the reason why it was successful was because of the gamification. And so you saw a lot of other companies think, okay, well, we've got to add gamification to our product. And it's quite easy to do that because basically you're already tracking all this information, right? If you are a fitness tracker, you're already tracking people's steps. So it's not that hard to develop a system where you give people a badge or leaderboard if they walk 10,000 steps, that sort of thing. And so it started spreading everywhere, really.
Right. And when did that spread kind of begin to trickle into things like workplaces, right? And I guess it started off with a bit of a shine to a degree, right? Where people felt like there was this whole world at their fingertips, and now it's quite rapidly become, I think, an example of a sort of dystopia.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of started in two different places. The first place is really consumer tech. So like, your Fitbit or iPhone apps, things that people choose to install, things like Duolingo. And I think, the worst you can say about them is that maybe they don't work, but at least, you're choosing to go and install them. I think, after that, you started seeing a lot of people say gamification is potentially the way to, just get positive outcomes for anything. So, for example, Obama's 2008 campaign, employed a kind of gamification to encourage volunteers to, call people to get to the polls. And people say, oh, maybe gamification helped that. And so there was just this idea that gamification could be used to do good things. And of course, you had a lot of gamification consultants going around saying, oh, well, wouldn't it be great if we could make the workplace more fun and more engaging, and make workers happier and make them work harder if we took these same tools that make volunteering for political campaigns or making running more interesting and use them in the workplace. And I think people wanted to believe that was true, partly because of like a completely different thing, which is that people want to believe that video games in general are a good thing. I think there's no mistaking the fact that over the last 10, 20 years, video games, which are already a big business, have become the biggest business in entertainment. They're bigger than Hollywood, bigger than TV, bigger than the music industry. And I think that sort of positive shine around video games has transferred to gamification. And so I think a lot of companies thought, oh, well, this is just a good thing. Why don't we deploy it? It probably doesn't cost that much, and it could save us a lot of money.
And it's one thing, as you say, if consumers are the ones being, quote, gamified, right? Where they're making these decisions, and it might not be, say, good for your brain with some of these, but and that's I'm not saying that about video games largely. I just mean something that like is addictive to a degree. I don't know, but it's a whole different ballgame when it's being used essentially to discipline workers and used to obscure unethical practices by corporations and their employers.
Yeah. I don't think it's great when people sort of download a brain training app and they think it's going to make them smarter, and it doesn't. But
Right.
That's a whole different dimension to you working at a call center and having to install some software on your laptop, which means that even it takes a photo of you every 5 minutes to make sure that you're not you haven't gone away from your computer. And if you aren't there, you get docked points, and that means that you step down the leaderboards. And so I think there's kind of a to me that's not great. I think the other thing that really bothers me as a kind of game designer and just as a human is that I think a lot of people, when they get the feedback about their performance from a game, they think if I failed, it's because it's my fault. Like I haven't been working hard enough, or I'm not good enough. Because when you play a video game or you play a board game and you die, usually it's because, well, you just aren't good enough at the game yet, and you will get better. But as I said before, one of the problems with gamification is that there's no reason why employers have to design their systems in a fair way. They can just make it get harder and harder for everyone every week. That doesn't mean they're doing that, but there's no transparency and there's no reason for them not to do that. And that's the concerning thing.
Absolutely. And it further atomizes or sections off the worker from some sort of human manager to a degree. And it makes, it makes employment decisions. I know Amazon, we'll get to them in a bit, but the way that they judge their workers' performance based on these internal algorithms might look outward facingly to the employee like a gaming system, but they're actually making quite cold-hearted decisions internally based on the data that they collect on that individual. And there's still that complete separation. It widens the gap between worker and management. Is that an accurate take largely with some of these gamification systems directed at workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think companies have always been interested in automation, in cutting costs, and I think a lot of managers just hate talking to workers because often, it's nice to give them good news. It's awful to give them bad news, and to sort of have to discipline workers. And so I think one of the things that a game does is it gives you a kind of interface as a manager, as an owner of a company, to reward and punish workers without you having to do it yourself and without you having to kind of feel even that bad about it, because you're like, well, that's just what the game does, right? And so I think it kind of meshes with the fact that a lot of people spend all their time playing games as we used to spend time watching TV. And so it kind of makes sense. It's easy to see your workers as these little kind of like non-player characters, as these just icons on a screen, and think, well, like they're just getting on with it. I don't need to worry about it. And yeah, it definitely atomizes, the community there.
We recently had a guest on who spoke about the trucking industry, written a book on the trucking industry. Can you talk about how some of these techniques are being utilized with truckers in particular?
Yeah, I mean, this has been fascinating for me. I think a lot of people look at gamification and think of the usual suspects like Amazon and Uber and high-tech industries. But, one of the things that has happened over the last 5-10 years is that basically all US truck drivers have had to install these electronic logging devices in their trucks. And the idea sounds good. It's to promote safety because they want to make sure that truck drivers aren't, driving for 24 hours straight. You've got to go and log how much you're driving and how much you're sleeping and resting using this device, and it's linked to your engine. Whereas before it was you just wrote it down in a book. And of course, after they added this requirement for truck drivers to have this, they thought, a lot of companies decided, well, if we're going to put this computer, this network connected computer into people's trucks, why don't we link it to other forms of performance monitoring? And so it was kind of like a backdoor for truck driving companies to gamify the experience of driving a truck. And so now, for a lot of drivers, they're automatically given points or deducted points or given achievements depending on how well they complete, their trips, how safely they drive, all of that sort of thing. And you can look at the reviews, and you can look at some of the feedback that drivers have left on these apps. Some of them complained about the fact that they're inaccurate, and they're saying, well, this thing doesn't know whether I'm actually, driving properly or not, and so I've been unfairly punished or rewarded. And other research has kind of shown that possibly it actually makes driving more unsafe because people are really trying to meet their deadlines, and which are delivered by these devices, and which are kind of enforced by hours of service rules, and so actually people end up being more unsafe. The funniest thing about all of this is that when you look at the truck driving companies and the people who sell these devices, they will say, well, gamification, it's a great way to make driving more entertaining and more fun for millennials. And I'm like, this is bonkers. Like, just because it's called a game doesn't mean it's actually fun. But, that is definitely something that they talk about a lot.
So when talking about truckers here, I am reminded of just how rapidly workplace protections have eroded in that industry in particular, where levels of unionization are way down from where they were decades previously, which I think is no coincidence. And you also see them in those more high-profile examples as well, where there are labor fights with mega corporations like Amazon. There was just an Uber driver strike a few weeks ago here in New York. And can you just talk more broadly about how this fits into the gig economy corporate model, one that's reliant on cheap labor, and almost the usage of this being a way to, I don't know, to keep that labor force in check while at the same time not really doing anything materially for them?
Yeah, it's it's a really interesting and sort of quite complex area, because whenever I talk about this, people are like, well, yeah, but isn't it like good for gig economy workers to have these like bonuses? It's just a way of them earning more money. In India, for example, they have this thing called Delivery Premier League, where every time you deliver something, you get like a run, like in cricket. And if you get lots of runs, and you can go and trade them in for like free motorcycles and laptops. And so it's everywhere. It's not just in the US. And I think, these sorts of incentives are really individual. They're really opaque. They rely on competition. So now you're competing against your colleagues, and they all mean that they lead to people overworking. I think working longer than they really wanted to. That's a common theme you'll see, and also having no idea how much they're going to get paid at the end of the week.
Right.
So
it increases insecurity, and also, as you say, undermines solidarity, because when you're competing in a game, it feels like you're competing against other workers in your same situation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that like when I notice this when workers come to these sectors, at first they think, wow, this is great. The company is looking after me. They're giving me all these opportunities to earn more. And often you'll see, experienced drivers, experienced Amazon workers who'll say, actually, I've been here for like 6 months, for like 2 years, and it never pans out, and it's just a way to get you to work harder. And people like Uber have said, ideally, we want you to drive as much as possible, right? And we will just keep giving you more stuff. So, it's not that it's impossible to figure out a way of making gamification actually work. It's just that in practice, the company's priorities are completely different to the workers' priorities.
And just moving on a bit from the corporate model of it, you also touch on gamification within governments. I mean, you alluded to it with the campaign. I'm reminded, of course, of Hillary Clinton's infamous Pokemon Go to the polls moment. Although that was not, I don't think. Either way, she just did not understand what she was doing to make it. She needed to make it a little more subtle, frankly. But you cite some of China's practices in your book as well, if you don't mind expanding on that.
Yeah, I mean, China is kind of one of those places where a lot of people have heard about this Chinese social credit score, and the reality is kind of simultaneously less scary and a little bit more scary than it seems. The reality is that there is no single credit score for 1.4 billion Chinese people. It's more just a bunch of experiments in a bunch of cities where they're trying to see whether they can establish trust. It's a weird thing. They want to establish trust between citizens and between governments by scoring citizens based on how well they behave. So, if you jaywalk, or if you return a library book late, or if you do other bad things, that you could get docked points. And if you do nice things like volunteer or donate blood, then you get points. And based on your point total, you can get things like lower interest loans or access to better public services. And so, when you look at what a lot of Chinese people say about this, some people are like, you know what, this sounds fine, because I don't actually like it when people jaywalk or when people kind of break the law. So if it stops people from doing that, that works. But of course, people in China are also saying, well, who decided this? It seems completely arbitrary. Why are we accepting this surveillance? They're not different from other people in other countries. So at the moment, it is not very widespread. And in a lot of places where it's been deployed, a lot of citizens have actually rebelled against it and said, actually, we don't want this. But I think the ambition is there, that they do keep on trying. And actually, during lockdowns, everyone had to install, COVID-19 apps to access different areas. And the kind of gamification piggybacked on top of that. So it's a bit worrying. But at the same time, we kind of have similar sorts of things in other countries, in the US and the UK.
Credit scores.
Scores, yeah. I mean, and those are really important. I have private health insurance, unfortunately, in the UK, because the NHS is not doing well. And if I buy healthy vegetables from the supermarket, I will get points. If I go to the gym, I'll get points. And the more points I have, I can save money on my premium. I can save money on going to the gym. I mean, it's real money. It's not small amounts of money. And so it's not, I think we sort of pat ourselves on the back and say, well, at least we don't have social credit score. It's like, yeah, but we kind of are being gamified in other ways. And there are real rewards and punishments, depending on how you do.
I'm real happy you brought that back to the context, because I mean, a lot of it, at least framed from a Western context, is imbued with xenophobia and things of that nature. But you do a great job of explaining just kind of how ubiquitous it is cross nationally. I wanted, before I let you go, to ask a bit about virtual reality, because this is the big pitch to investors. This is Mark Zuckerberg's new frontier. He's going to build a virtual, and I know, and look, I don't know a ton about gaming, so I apologize for sounding kind of new to this, but that's what he's trying to really incorporate with Meta, right? Even though it's been done before, they're trying to make it, that's the new pitch to investors. What's your sense of that?
Well, I mean, the tech industry wants to keep growing, and I think they want more of our lives to be mediated through, the internet, through digital devices. And so whether it's the metaverse or virtual reality or augmented reality, the idea is that however much time you spend on your phone, on your computer, we want people to spend more time with, virtual reality and heads-up displays. And you can imagine some ways in which that's actually useful. Like, if you go to a party and you forget people's names, as I always do, then it's kind of useful having that, or having maps and directions shown on your glasses. But of course, it would be naive to think that these wouldn't also be used for work. They wouldn't be used to monitor people in other ways. And frankly, if the last 15 years is any indication, anything that can be gamified, anything that can be measured and tracked and sent to servers will be gamified. And I think that will be a really central way for companies, big companies and small companies, to try and manipulate people to, whether that's work harder or just, behave in a certain way.
Adrian Hon, game designer, author of You've Been Played: How Corporations, Governments, and Schools Use Game. Oh, actually, really quick question before I let you go. I'm so sorry, because the school element I wanted to touch on.
Sure.
We in the United States, we went through a period where billionaire Bill Gates decided it was his mission to essentially make schools in his image. It was a privatization push, but also a way to make himself some more money by incorporating technology into schooling. What is some of what you've seen in your research on that front? And then I actually will let you go.
I mean, this is the most eye-opening part of the book, of my research, was this app called Class Dojo, which is used in supposedly 95% of US schools. And it is a way basically for teachers to reward and deduct points from students, during classes. And so you might think, oh, it's fine, we've done that. But actually, it's kind of, you can use it to deduct points based on whether, a student goes to the bathroom too much or talks too much or is antisocial. And the points are persistent, and they can be, exchanged for prizes and rewards. And, I mean, it's kind of incredible, honestly, because some parents love it and some parents say this is just absolutely dystopian. Some teachers love it because they see it as a way of controlling the classroom, right? You can just say, all right, I'm just minusing 50 points from all of you, and that means you don't get this privilege. And it's just so much more rapid and so much more kind of visceral and scary, I think, for a lot of kids than other mechanisms before. And I think we've really got to ask ourselves, is this a way in which we want to motivate children to learn, right? Maybe it is a good way of controlling the classroom, but at the same time, studies have shown that actually, even if you motivate people to be quiet, it actually makes people less interested, kids less interested in lessons. So maybe all they're doing is just trying to maximize their points rather than, enjoy learning French or something.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you for that last question there, Adrian Hon, game designer, author of You've Been Played: How Corporations, Governments, and Schools Use Games to Control Us All. We'll put the link to the book in the description on the podcast, YouTube, app, etc. Thank you so much, Adrian. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.